Hello, today we are going to read the story Animals of the Freshwater Habitat. Our learning targets are to identify different habitats, identify characteristics of the freshwater habitat, demonstrate an understanding of the word float and the phrase a fish out of water, and then we are going to write and draw about characteristics of the freshwater habitat. Our key vocabulary are amphibious, float, freshwater, gills, and waterproof. Amphibious. Amphibious is an adjective, and it means able to live both in water and on land. Our frog tank has areas of dry land and water for swimming because frogs are amphibious. Float. Float is a verb, and it means to stay on top of the water without sinking. The children watch their toy boats float in the bathtub. Freshwater is an adjective, and it means related to water that is not salty. Every summer, our family goes to a freshwater pond to swim. Gills. Gills are the parts of the body that fish and other underwater animals use to breathe. We went to the aquarium and saw the trout's large gills on the side of its body as it swam by. So these are the gills right there. Waterproof is an adjective, and waterproof keeps water out. I wore waterproof gloves to keep my hands dry while moving wood into the back of the truck in the rain. Or I wore waterproof rain boots to keep my feet dry while jumping in puddles. All right, so what have we already learned? What is the earth made out of? Like the surface of the earth, what is covering our earth? Continents and oceans, or more simply, land and water. Okay, what are some of the different habitats that we've already learned about? We've learned about the Arctic, the Sonoran Desert, the East African savanna, the temperate deciduous forest, and the tropical rainforest, right? Now, those habitats, are they mainly land or mainly water habitats? They're mainly land habitats. Today, we are going to learn about another habitat, but it's going to be a mainly water habitat. This habitat is called the freshwater habitat. Freshwater is water that does not have very much salt in it. It is often water that people can drink. A freshwater habitat is different from the water habitat found in the Arctic Ocean, which is called a saltwater habitat. Water found in oceans is salty and therefore not for drinking. This image shows different kinds of freshwater habitats, such as rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds. Think of some of the freshwater habitats near us or that you've seen. I know that at the barn where my pony is, they have quite a few streams, so those would all be freshwater. What are some freshwater habitats that you might have seen? Remember our key vocabulary: amphibious, float, freshwater, gills, and waterproof. Listen carefully to learn about the different kinds of plants and animals in a freshwater habitat. Hello again, glad you could join me. I thought that we needed a real change, so I've come off dry land to a place where it's wet all the time. A lake. A lake is an area of water that is surrounded by land or has land all around. There is a lot of water in the world. In fact, water covers most of the Earth's surface. But only a tiny part of the world's water is fresh water, the kind of water you and I can drink because it has very little salt in it. Fresh water is found in streams, rivers, lakes, and ponds. The water in these streams, rivers, lakes, and ponds come from rain and from melting ice and snow. Isn't it amazing to think that the water from the drinking fountain at school or from the faucets in your house all come from rain? I'm here at the water's edge, or where the water meets the land, to explore this lake and the plants and animals that call this freshwater habitat home. Freshwater habitats have many kinds of fish, birds, insects, and other animals. Standing here, I can see an enormous, or very big, leaf in the water. Let me climb on it so that we can get a closer look. This is a water lily leaf. Okay, so what he's standing on, that's a water lily leaf. A water lily is a plant that lives in the water near the edges of ponds and lakes. Plants are important in freshwater habitats because they make the oxygen for animals to breathe. Plants are also food for the animals to eat, and they can provide the shelter to protect animals from their predators. Remember, a predator is an animal that hunts other animals. The leaves of the water lily are very large, round, and green, and they float on the surface of the water. If the leaves float on the surface of the water, that means that they can stay on top of the water and they don't sink. The water lily is well adapted for living in its habitat. Like the kapok trees in the rainforest, the lily's large leaves let it get as much sunlight as it needs for food and energy. Lilies are also food for many animals, believe it or not. Animals like deer, porcupine, beavers, and turtles all eat the leaves, whereas ducks and geese like to eat the roots. Some animals, like fish and frogs, use the lily's leaves as hiding places, and the flowers bring bees and other insects. I am going to float around the edge of the lake on this water lily leaf, but I'm going to have to leave soon because this pesky turtle will not leave my leaf alone. I've pushed out from the edge of the lake a little, and I already can see another kind of plant that lives here. It is called a cattail, and it gets its name from the unusual way it looks. Thankfully for me, it doesn't have much to do with real cats. Cattails have long, thin stems with foot-long, furry flower spikes at the top that turn from green in the early summer to brown in the fall. The flower spike feels soft and furry and looks like a cat's tail, but I think it looks more like a hot dog. What do you think? Do you think it looks more like a cat's tail or a hot dog? I kind of think it looks more like a hot dog. The plants can reach up to 9 feet high, which lets them get as much sunlight as they need. As with water lilies, some animals use cattails for food and shelter. Muskrats and geese like to eat the roots of the cattail, and the juicy green shoots are a favorite of the moose and elk. Moose and elk, like caribou, are part of the deer family. So here's your moose, and here's your elk. Many kinds of birds make their homes among the cattails. It's very hard to see anything in there because cattails grow so thickly, so it's a good place for birds to build their nest and to lay and hatch their eggs. Predators like snakes and frogs also live among the cattails and search for animals like birds and insects for food. I think I'm going to move on now. As you know, I'm not very good with snakes. Come with me beneath the water and let's take a look at what's under there. Here are some nice looking rainbow trout. Fish can only live in water and they breathe underwater using gills on the sides of their bodies. Gills take in oxygen from the water around them, and fish have strong tails that they use for swimming and fins that they use for steering and balance. The rainbow trout is a carnivore. Remember, a carnivore is an animal that eats other animals. It eats other water animals like insects, other fish, and sometimes shellfish. It even eats some small land animals like mice if it gets the chance, so I'm sure it wouldn't mind a nibble of a rat. Rainbow trout like to live in rivers, but some prefer the deeper water of big lakes. I enjoyed exploring beneath the surface of the water, and now I'm going to rest on a lily pad again. While I'm drying off a bit, let me show you a kind of frog called a bullfrog that I can see sitting at the water's edge. Frogs are amphibious, which means they live both in the water and on land. Bullfrogs are the largest kind of frog in North America, and they can grow more than half a foot long and weigh more than a pound. That's a really big frog. The bullfrog gets its name from the loud cow-like noise it makes. A male cow is called a bull. What sound does a cow make? Moo. Okay. I bet birds and turtles would be pretty surprised to know that a frog can make such a loud sound. Pretty neat, huh? This bullfrog is resting now, but it'll come out to hunt when it gets dark. Bullfrogs eat lots of different kinds of food. They are carnivores, so they eat small fish, snakes, birds, and insects like this dragonfly that's buzzing above my head. This is an adult dragonfly. Adult means grown up. Adult dragonflies are flying insects with long bodies and wings. Dragonflies live around lakes, streams, and other freshwater habitats because they lay their eggs in water. Adult dragonflies eat other insects like mosquitoes, flies, and bees. The dragonfly uses its long wings to hover around in the air or stay in one place while flying, where it catches its food. It has to be careful because the bullfrog isn't the only one that likes to eat dragonflies. Birds and turtles like to eat them too. The water is getting a little rough out here. Ah, that's why. Here come some birds that like to eat insects. These are a kind of duck called mallards. Ducks are birds that can live both in and out of water, but it's the water where they spend most of their time. Like all birds, ducks, like these mallards, are covered in feathers. Did you know that ducks' feathers are waterproof? If something is waterproof, it keeps waters out. Ducks rub special oil from their tails all over their feathers because oil and water don't mix. Water drips right off the ducks without getting their feathers wet. Ducks float on the surface of the water and have large webbed feet that help them paddle. They dip their heads underwater and use their beaks, which are called bills, to search for food at the bottom of the lake. Here, the word bill refers to duck's beak. Mallards eat grasses and seeds from plants and small animals like insects, worms, snails, frogs, and small fish. Well, we've had a good look around this freshwater habitat, but I have got to get off this lily leaf before these ducks knock me off. There's another kind of water habitat, and we're going to have to look at it next time. I hope you'll join me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to start on my long trip back to shore. Okay, if you need to hop up and take a wiggle break, go ahead and do that, and then come right back. Okay, is most of the Earth's water fresh water or salt water? Most of it is salt water. I want you to describe the freshwater habitat. Okay, let's think about the living things there. Are there a lot of plants and animals that live in the freshwater habitat? Yeah, there were a lot, weren't there? And does it have good shelter for all sorts of different animals? Yeah, the cattails, because they grow so thick, it makes it hard for those animals to be found, which is a great place to have your home if you're trying to protect yourself from predators. Okay. What are some of the plants that live in the freshwater habitat? Water lilies and cattails. What kind of animals live in freshwater habitats? Fish, like the rainbow trout, birds, including ducks, insects, including dragonflies, bees, mosquitoes, and flies, frogs, including bullfrogs, deer, porcupine, beavers, turtles, muskrats, geese, okay, a whole bunch of animals. And how have dragonflies adapted to live in a freshwater habitat? It has something to do with their eggs. They lay their eggs in the water, and then they eat the insects that live in freshwater habitats like mosquitoes and flies and bees. Why are the water lilies so important to freshwater habitats? It's because they provide oxygen for animals to breathe and food for them to eat. Those leaves, remember, they talked about the leaves were like the leaves in the rainforest. They're really wide so that they can get a lot of sun and create a lot of oxygen. And the animals that live in and around the water, they need that oxygen to breathe, right? We also talked about how the lilies, they were even like shelter. They were hiding places for some like the turtles or bugs, right? And then they were even food. So they were shelter and food to these other animals that live there. All right. In the read aloud you heard, the leaves of the water lily are very large, round, and green, and they float on the surface of the water. Say the word float with me. Float. Can you whisper the word float? Float. Can you mouse voice the word float? Float. If things float on water, that means they stay on top of the water. They do not sink. In the summer, I like to float in the pool. I am going to describe a situation. If it is an example of something that does float, say, that floats. If it is an example of something that does not float, say, that does not float. The leaf fell from the tree and landed on the surface of the water. That floats. Harry threw a rock and it sank to the bottom of the pond. That does not float. The boat rocked gently back and forth on top of the waves. That floats. The dolphin dove deep into the ocean. That does not float. There are many pennies under the water at the bottom of the water fountain. That does not float. So, have you ever heard of the saying, a fish out of water? Have you ever heard of that? Well, if you haven't heard of it, or even if you have, what would happen to a fish that was out of water? The fish would not be able to live, right? It would be really uncomfortable, and it couldn't live very long because they can only breathe underwater using their gills. So being out of the water would be bad for the fish. The saying, a fish out of water, is used to talk about people who aren't in their usual place or who are in an uncomfortable situation. People would survive if they weren't in their usual place or in familiar circumstances, but they might feel uncomfortable or strange, okay? So if you were the only person who forgot to wear shoes to school, you might feel like a fish out of water, right? That's something that's unusual, and it might embarrass you a little bit, okay? And if you started at a new school and you didn't know anybody, you might feel like a fish out of water at first because you don't know anybody and it's not what you're used to, okay? Can you give me an example of when you might be feeling like a fish out of water? All right. Let's make sure we have hit all of our targets. We identified different habitats. We talked about the characteristics of freshwater habitats. We demonstrated an understanding of the words float and the phrase a fish out of water. And then here in just a moment, you are going to write and draw about characteristics of the freshwater habitat. Awesome.